The reason we are posting this audio of the 1963 Builderberg meeting is so everyone realizes that your governments are listening to the people at the Builderberg meetings. And the Bilderberg meetings are run by Rothschild, D. Rothschild, Rockefeller, Soros, and of course they pretend they all hate Soros, but they all are in his pockets. In any event, listen to this, take whatever action you feel necessary to correct the problem. And this is a long, ongoing problem.
Bilderberg Meetings Cannes Conference 29, the 3rd of March 963. Participant list has been moved to a separate file. Introduction. The 12th Bilderberg meeting was held on 29, 30 and the 3rd of March 963 at the Hotel Martinez, Cannes, France, under the chairmanship of H.R.H., the Prince of the Netherlands. Participants numbered 90 and represented the United States, Canada and 15 European countries together with various international organizations. They were drawn from among political leaders, members of governments and parliamentarians, and leading figures in business, journalism, the civil service, national and international, the liberal professions and trade union organizations. In accordance with the rules of procedure adopted at each meeting, all participants spoke on an absolutely personal basis without committing any government or organization to which they might belong. In order to facilitate complete frankness, the discussions were confidential and no representatives of the press were admitted. A short press release in which the chairman's was the only name mentioned was distributed beforehand, but no further release was issued at the conclusion of the meeting. 3 items were included on the agenda: I. The balance of power in the light of recent international developments. E. Trade relations between the USA and Europe in the light of the negotiations for Britain's entry into the common market. 3. Trade relations between the Western world and the developing countries, tariffs, quotas, commodity arrangements, etc. At This item will cover changes in power relations, political, economic and military, between the communist and Western countries and inside each group. On account of developments subsequent to the preparation of this agenda, particularly the collapse of the Brussels negotiations between Britain and the EEC, and the close connection between this fact and items I and II, the chairman asked participants, in dealing with item I, to give preference to the subject of the political and military relations existing between the Western allies without thereby excluding certain current economic political problems which have arisen as a result of the failure of the Brussels discussions. In dealing with item E, to concentrate on future prospects, more especially in regard to the Kennedy Round, and certain specific problems such as the coordination of agricultural policies. Since certain participants were absent when the meeting opened, item I was dealt with first, although various participants returned to this item during the last session. The original order of the various items has been adhered to in the present text, in accordance with another of the Bilderberg meetings rules, aimed at preserving the confidential nature of the discussions. None of the participants is mentioned by name in the present report. I. The balance of power in the light of recent international developments. In the course of a preliminary note, H.R.H., the Prince of the Netherlands had suggested that participants should concentrate more particularly on a consideration of the following questions: what impact will the growing strength of Europe have on the relations between the U.S. and Europe in world affairs? Competition, cooperation, a partnership? What are the conditions for a partnership? Is the idea of a multilateral, a multinational nuclear force an answer to the troubles of the alliance? What exactly does it mean? How is the problem of the ultimate political control of such a force to be solved? What is the relevance of this concept to the current general disarray of the alliance? Participants particularly qualified to discuss the matter were also asked to give their views on the recent Franco-German treaty and on its role within the common market and the Atlantic Alliance. A written note had previously been drawn up by an Italian participant who referred to its main lines of argument in addressing the meeting. The failure of the Russian bluff over Cuba, wrote this participant, demonstrated that there is a balance at an extremely high level of destruction between the military potential of the United States and the USSR. B. That Khrushchev recognizes this fact and that, whatever he may say in public, he is prepared to accept the consequences of this balance. There was therefore reason to hope that peaceful coexistence, without open hostility, would continue for some time. This balance, argued the author of the note, was entirely based on the American deterrent independently of other national forces. At the same time, the conflict was continuing on the ideological level, and it would be ill-advised for the moment to hope too much from the Russo-Chinese disagreements, however deep, all the more since the lack of unity within the Western world was also real and serious. The most important question in this connection was that of American leadership. For his own part, the author of the note was in favor of accepting such leadership unreservedly. It was, he wrote, a fact of existence, if only because America spends 4 times as much on arms as all the other members of NATO combined. It followed that American leadership, based on the only real deterrent force against the USSR, constituted NATO's cornerstone, notwithstanding European recovery on the economic level. True, arrangements could and should be found to render that leadership as little burdensome as possible, but to reject it purely and simply could only create a dangerous neutralism, especially if it took the form of a sort of anti-colonialism, directed at America. The author went on to discuss the circumstances surrounding the recent breakdown of negotiations between the United Kingdom and the EEC, and expressed his bitter regret concerning them. The breakdown, he said, was a blow from which European integration might never recover. True, the French rejection was delivered in accordance with the provisions of the Rome Treaty, which calls for unanimity among governments of the community as regards the admission of new members, but it ran counter to the only line of action which would enable genuine European Union to develop, namely compromise between the wishes of the various European countries, each being merely a part of a greater whole. The author of the note considered that what was still more serious was the fact that, at his press conference, General de Gaulle should have let it be understood that the choice was not between Paris and London but between Paris and Washington, on whose behalf Great Britain would have played the role of Trojan horse within the common market. In actual fact, he wrote, on the basis of their attachment to NATO and their acceptance of American leadership, Italy and the Benelux countries might equally well be considered as Trojan horses. The author of the note concluded by emphasizing that the Soviet threat remained as real as ever and that, given Khrushchev's skill in exploiting divisions within the Western camp, complete unity was more than ever essential. Discussions on this item of the agenda revealed that the meeting could generally adhere to the concepts advanced by the author of the note in respect of the need to remain loyal to NATO and to accept American superiority as a fact. Considerable divergences of opinion became apparent, however, in regard to the application of those postulates now and in the future. A large number of speakers took up the criticism of the policy of the present French government, which seemed, directly or indirectly, to have inspired the note. One of the French speakers observed that many of his compatriots, like himself, only partially supported General de Gaulle's European and Atlantic policy and, more especially, the methods sometimes employed by the President of the Republic. Nonetheless, in his view, it would be a mistake not to avoid any reprisals or controversial statements likely to harm French national prestige. If pressure were considered necessary, it should be applied in the form of understanding and friendship. Other French speakers argued on similar lines. A British speaker wished to dissociate himself from certain criticisms leveled at the general, whom he considered a great man, a great Frenchman and even a great European. The persistence of the Soviet threat emphasized in the note was raised by several participants during the discussion. A British speaker, supported by a German participant, defined the policy of the USSR as follows: not to maintain the existing balance but to tip the scales in favor of the USSR. For this purpose, to exploit every opportunity provided by the West. Khrushchev had merely recognized that this needed time. at the present time. Moreover, given the fact that the situation in Cuba, the Middle East and Africa, not to mention China, was not very favorable from his point of view, his primary objective remained the Western countries. Berlin was still Khrushchev's main concern, especially if one bore in mind his apprehension regarding the possible provision of nuclear weapons to the Federal Republic. The German speaker did not a priori include Cuba in the list of Russian defeats. It was rather that Khrushchev had wanted to avoid full-scale conflict in an area where the military conditions were particularly unfavorable from his point of view. At the present time, Khrushchev considered Cuba as a political bridgehead. In the German speaker's opinion, the danger still lay in Berlin. The uneasy situation currently prevailing within the Atlantic Alliance was generally recognized, and a very large number of speakers sought to analyze the causes and the symptoms on both sides of the Atlantic. What are the features of the Atlantic crisis? Several participants attempted to define them and to recommend steps to eliminate them. The main elements brought out in the course of the discussion may be listed as follows, although the same discussion revealed that they were closely interconnected: the failure of the Brussels negotiations, the doubts sometimes expressed in Europe as to the United States' determination to use their nuclear deterrent in support of their allies in the event of war, the lack of balance between United States' nuclear power and the forces of its European partners, and, as a result, the problems arising from American leadership, the French determination to create an independent nuclear force and the resulting apprehension that dissemination, and even proliferation, of nuclear weapons might take place, the divergences between the Allies as to the formulas whereby the NATO treaty might be improved, if necessary, more especially as regards the supreme control of nuclear weapons. Although the breakdown of the negotiations for Great Britain's entry into the European Economic Community, which followed on General de Gaulle's press conference of the 14th of January 1996, was more specifically the subject of item 2 of the agenda, several participants raised the matter as early as this stage of the discussions in connection with the uneasy situation within the Atlantic Alliance. Recent happenings in Brussels had caused extremely sharp disappointment in the United States, and the point was emphasized by several American party CIPANs who considered that the Atlantic Alliance had suffered a blow, all the more serious in that it was inflicted by allies. Several of the American speakers observed that Europeans perhaps failed to appreciate to the full the radical break in the United States' former traditions which that country's adherence to NATO represented. That adherence had now been accepted by all sectors of American public opinion, including those who were previously the most traditionally isolationist, e.g. the farm voters of the Middle West, and support for the organization had taken on an almost religious character which made any blow administered to it all the more serious. There was a great desire to achieve real unity with Europe, including Great Britain, via the Trade Expansion Act. There was a danger that the Brussels failure would render that long-term policy illusory, and the French decision struck the American public as a refusal to recognize any entity superior to the nation, or even to recognize a greater common denominator. The American public saw this as a return to isolationism, a European cartelism, and was profoundly disturbed. While all the European speakers discussing the failure of the Brussels negotiations recognized its harmful consequences for the Atlantic Alliance, there were some who showed themselves anxious to reduce the question to narrower proportions. A French speaker, for instance, considered that two problems had been confused: a political problem in that the original purpose in creating the Europe of the Six had been to enable Germany to recover its place in the concert of nations without at the same time recovering all the elements of national sovereignty, so that transfer of these to a higher community became necessary. At the time, this policy had been opposed both by the British as a whole and by General de Gaulle's supporters. An economic problem arising at the Atlantic level, and which should not therefore be presented in terms of Great Britain's adherence to the common market. There was, in this speaker's view, no contradiction between a politically integrated Europe, even limited to 6 members, and an Atlantic world cooperating closely in the military and economic fields. A Belgian participant described the 14th of January as the Free World's Black Monday and, more specifically, felt that the method adopted by the French government was inadmissible because of its unilateral nature. Emphasizing the community quality of the Europe to be built, implying a spirit of solidarity which went beyond individual nations, this speaker advanced the view that French diplomacy no longer believed in this concept.